always interested in the fact that, like, on a rainy day, people come out to hear a talk that's called How to Read an Art Magazine. I mean, we've tried to title certain lectures in this series, which is brought together under the collective title of Creative Lives and Careers, which is also the content of a book that I'm working on, which is a book of sort of collected texts and interview fragments and advice from various people, artists and curators and critics, about what I call the distinction between a creative life and a career. And what I usually say about that is that a creative life is something that you give yourself, meaning that you dictate the terms of what you're interested in, you choose the mediums you're interested in working with, you pretty much decide what the framework of your own practice is going to be. You know, do you have a studio space? Do you work on your kitchen table? Do you work late at night? Do you want to make 14 things this year or 40 things? You know, budgets become part of that as well. But pretty much your own interests are the thing that drives your creativity and your sense of making. Careers are something that other people give you, meaning that once you try to put those things that you've made in the world, you run into other people who have a vested interest in what you do, because it lets them do things that they want to do. Meaning, I can't do anything without artworks. As a curator, like, I can't, there's nothing for me to show. As a writer, there's nothing for me to write about. If you're a dealer, obviously you're interested in selling work, making exhibitions. All of those things are things that are now more of a dialogue between you, the artist, and these other agents who operate in the art world. And what one hopes to be able to do, obviously, is align your creative interests with the right people in the field to create, like, a nourishable career. And ideally, those things are not adversarial at all, but I try to make the point that one shouldn't confuse the two. You know, they have very different rules and regulations. And so what the talk tonight is about, and you'll forgive me a little, just I've been sort of fighting a cold and trying not to cough through this whole thing. This talk, How to Read an Art Magazine, is really an attempt to show people how to deconstruct what is in a magazine so that the information becomes a little more transparent and useful for you, right? I always like to say that I sort of started this talk probably when I was 17 years old, although I didn't know it then, which was, I started out as an artist. I went to Cooper Union in New York, and mostly when I was painting and my paintings were wet and I could not work on anything else, I would go to the Cooper Union library and start to pore over art magazines. Now, it dawned on me that, like, as a young person interested in, like, the art that came before me, that there were only so many places where you could actually learn about that. That art history seemed like it was big monographs on shelves, like Henry Moore or whatever. I mean, you've got books here. You know, these are the people who have, in a sense, won. They've achieved a moment where they've got, you know, scholarship written about them, or you go to a library and read collected essays by various important theorists or critics. And so that's one way of understanding, like, what goes on before you. But that's certainly not the entirety of everything that goes on in terms of, like, well, what's not being canonized? Who are the artists who are making work where they've got some shows, but they're not Chuck Close, you know what I mean? Or they're not Eva Hess. They're like 3 people to the left or right of those people who might all have interesting careers and have made interesting contributions, but they have not been absorbed to the level that some of these other folks have. Where do you find out about those people? The exhibitions they had, what was said about them, the advertisements promoting those exhibitions, where they showed in 1972 and then where they went on to show in 1987. There's really no way for you to understand that without looking at art magazines. And I didn't really know that until I started to take those big bound copies of Art Forum and Flash Art and Arts and Art News out and just sit there and sort of peruse them. And what I realized, and what I want to sort of talk about today, is that the information that was in those magazines, I didn't realize that I was absorbing to the degree that I was. And now what I've done is to try to take some of those things and turn them into a little presentation that sort of makes this not a big mystery, so that you can certainly like look at magazines for your own pleasure. I think we all have that sense of like, it's fun to just scan, right? But if you want to do more than scan, and you want to try to use this stuff, what I'm going to hope to try to unpack tonight is just a little bit of where and how to look, and you could do this with almost any magazine. The three things that I've sort of pulled out to show you are all things that we have over here. You can subscribe to these magazines, obviously. You can go to Borders and do this like for free. You can go to a library and do it. It's not that you have access to these things, right? Just out of curiosity, how many people in the room are art magazine readers? And the range of things that you might read would include what? Like what would be the magazines that you pay attention to?
Art News.
Modern Painters, Art Forum, Art News, Art Papers. And then of course, and those are all sort of various magazines that all try to do a certain thing. A lot of these magazines, the more you get to know them, you start to understand the particular thing they're interested in, right? Art News, for all practical purposes, is kind of, and has always been the sort of Time magazine of art magazines. It's probably the broadest in its interests. Art in America was always a little bit more scholarly or academic. Art Forum was always a little more critical and theoretical. October, which is more of a journal, or Flash Art, was always international. Arts Magazine, now defunct, was always sort of more poetic. So, you know, the people that run these different programs, these different magazines, have an agenda that they set, and then the content in those magazines obviously follows suit, okay? But, so, here's Art in America, the cover of Art in America, right? That's the masthead. You may not have paid attention to the masthead before, okay? But the information that you can use is 3 or 4 pages in. And so, for example, and I know this may seem sort of, you know, remedial, but not really. And by doing this talk the way I want to do it, I'm also telling you something about how myself and this art center locates itself within the field. Because clearly I pay attention to these magazines. It's hard to have one of these kinds of exhibiting venues that doesn't. We, of course, hope to be located in the context of these magazines in terms of ads, reviews. But something else happens here, which is you can come to understand a little more about what we do here when you look at these magazines. And what I mean by that is sculpture in the contracted field. Nancy Princenthal is an art critic who we've brought here, who's lectured here. Barbara Pollock in the frame, writing about MoMA. Barbara Pollock has lectured here. I didn't make these people up. These are people in the field, and part of the reason I think we've started to get people paying attention to our programming is because we are bringing these people who might not come to Atlanta otherwise. And so when you read some of these folks, and then a place like the Contemporary brings them here, if you read them and pay attention to what they're doing, by the time you show up to one of their lectures, you have a boatload of information. Which means your dialogue with those people when they're here, even if it's brief, might be a much more informed kind of exchange, right? What's interesting also is that if you read these magazines repeatedly, now, if you don't know what Nancy Princenthall's interests are, the fact that she's writing about expanded notions of sculpture may be, oh, that seems interesting. She's been doing that for almost 20 years. She writes by choice, usually about sculpture, usually about women making sculpture. So if you are a woman making sculpture, this is a person who you want to have on your radar, right? You go down the field here. Here's the editor, here's the managing editor, all of that's great. Here are the contributing editors, here are the editors by region. And it should not surprise you here that Rebecca Dimling Cochran is a name who you may know, you may run into her here. She comes to a lot of our stuff, you'll see her all around town. If you want to get your local work understood by a critic who has the ability to write about a show you may have, that's who it is. Years ago, in other forms, Jerry Cullum is certainly somebody you all know, maybe, who's writes for art papers. He used to write for Art in America, he used to write for Art News. He was the local person. The magazines, often in regions that are not sort of like dominant art centers, like LA or New York, will often have one person who's representing the entire region. And so when they get something in their box at Art in America or Art News that looks interesting to them that they want to review, that's who they're going to call. And so these are the names that start to become interesting. Franny Colpit in Fort Worth, Michael Duncan in Los Angeles. And so what you'll start to see, Peter Seltz, all these people have been writing reviews of exhibitions at large venues and small ones all over the country for years. Some of these people are poets, some of these people are artists. So the masthead is the place where you want to get to know who some of these folks are. And if you want them to know who you are, it is not inconceivable to think of writing to them, dear Nancy Princenthal, care of Art in America, because she's a friend and hopefully she's not going to now be bombarded by things. But I would urge you to, here's my disclaimer, don't send things to people that I tell you like this without knowing something about them. So by the time you write them, you can say something like, Dear Nancy, I loved your recent article on Eva Hess. I'm working in Atlanta, working with blah, 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 and thought you'd like to know what I'm up to. Whatever, you know, whatever you're trying to do. You're just trying to get on people's radar. So this is a more helpful way to kind of like narrow the field. Anybody in the room know who Dieter Roth is? Okay. Dieter Roth, and I'm assuming that Bjorn Roth is his son. Dieter Roth is a artist, a Swiss-German artist, who's known for mostly a series of book works. Starts out sort of in the 1960s. He's an artist who's associated often with the Fluxus movement, which is a kind of time with pop art. A lot of Fluxus work you may know, performative, ephemeral, a lot of it doesn't last. Dieter Roth is very famous for making works with materials that rot and decay. Books made of cheese, drawings that have food on them. And so an exhibition by Hauser and Wirth of work tables paying attention to ads is interesting. Part of the reason that I've always been fascinated with how artists promote themselves or how institutions promote themselves is you're trying to reach an audience about an exhibition of your work, right? What image are you going to show? And if you go through any number of magazines, and you can do it very easily, you'll see pictures of artworks often, right? Here's a detail of an artwork, you can do it here. For all practical purposes, these kinds of posters and postcards are variations on ads, right? So you can do it and say, well, you know, that might be an ad, this might be an ad of Gerard Byrne at the Renaissance Society. Image of an artwork, information about the venue, dates, website, pretty straightforward. I always felt like a straight picture of an artwork was never a really interesting ad. It was just personal. A detail of an artwork, that's where something's left a little unknown, might be more interesting. Photographs of artist studios, photographs of people in the process of making the work. So a little one step to the left or right often leaves a little more room for interpretation. This says as much about Dieter Roth and his work as a picture of an artwork might be, and I think more interesting. So you'll find as you look at art magazines pretty consistently that artists and their agents or institutions or dealers are often figuring out interesting ways to promote what they do. Sooner or later, whether it's on Burnaway or Creative Loafing or the AJC or some blog or something, even just in Atlanta, let alone an international magazine, you're going to have a chance at some point to take out an ad that promotes what you do. What is that ad going to look like? And the sooner that you pay attention to the ads, the closer you're going to be to either making ads that seem lively or might jump out of a page. These magazines now are as thick as Vogue. So how are you going to make an ad that looks slightly different than all of the other ads? So that's another thing to sort of pay attention to. The other thing that this tells you is what galleries show what artists. So if you find artists in advertisements that are intriguing to you, that you feel a connection with, their work looks like your work, or their work is about subjects that are parallel to your work's subjects, this is now an interesting way to know about galleries that might be places you want to go. They may be places that you think of being able to show at, and that may be several further steps down the road. But just to identify galleries that are of like mind with what you do is another interesting way to gain information. So that if you go to that city, if you go to an art fair, if you go to Miami Basel, which is not very far from us here in Atlanta, well, if you have information about a handful of galleries that do things that you've identified as interesting, even if you've never been there, again, by the time you meet somebody at that gallery, you have a boatload more knowledge to share. All of this is in these magazines. It's not hard to find. You just need to start to pay attention to this. The back of the magazines, this is still all now Art America. Back of the magazines is often where things like information, calls for exhibitions, framers, residencies are listed. Now you can access a lot of the stuff online, obviously. You can Google artist residencies and you'll get a million variations on everything from Hambidge here in Georgia to Yaddo or McDowell or any number of things all over the world. From little places to big places, to ones in cities, to ones in rural communities. But again, if you're looking for a fast way of identifying where information is posted by people in the field, this is what you're going to find. Galleries, internet relationships, paints, where a paint and pigment is a very well-known place in New York. It's probably one of the best places to buy ground pigments. And you may not know where to get a particular kind of green you're looking for. And you would not necessarily think to look at the back of an art magazine to find that out. So there's a lot of information buried in these things. This is now, again, still Art in America. At the back of the magazine, again, is a series of information which is really about moving and changes in the art world. Who's going to what institution? When I moved from New York to Pennsylvania, then to Portland, then to Atlanta, I sent a little press release to Stephanie Cash at Art in America, and she posted, Stuart Horodner is now going to this institution, because those people were aware of something I did and now I'm doing it somewhere else. Not rah-rah me, it's just that this is where that information gets posted. People die, this is where it gets posted. Louis Corrigan, our friend here in Atlanta, decided he was going to start to give away some funding to artists and artist agencies here in Atlanta. Sent a press release to Art in America. They said, ooh, Possible Futures, a new granting organization in Atlanta, is doing interesting things. That's where it appeared, right? So that's how and where that information is. And what you can start to see is awards and grants, Creative Time. We had Nato Thompson here from Creative Time. You can start to see who's winning certain grants, who's winning certain awards. Oh, Sayed Arjamani, that's an artist who works with architecture. We have one of his major pieces here he did for the Olympics. If your work is about architecture, he just won that prize. Maybe you should check out what that prize is. And it's not that you're going to get all of these things, it's just a layer of awareness that becomes a little bit more tangible. Okay. art papers. This is an easy one because they're located in Atlanta, and you have probably the most access to be able to reach some of the folks who manage the thinking around this publication, Sylvie and others. Their auction, many of you know, is tomorrow night. So again, here is art papers. They tell you right above the top there what they're aspiring to be talking about: striking ideas, moving images, smart texts. And again, if you open art papers, you're going to find a masthead with all of the stuff that Art in America's masthead reveals. This is a page from the back which shows you a review of an artist named Alex Hubbard in New York City. You're seeing 4 large process-driven paintings. Alex Hubbard is an artist who I'm interested in. Hubbard is an artist who is in 2 or 3 Atlanta collections. He makes paintings, he makes videos about painting, he makes works that are all sort of in this procedural, messy kind of way of working. I'm working on a big painting show. I'm thinking of his work for it. But if you're an artist who often is going to get asked to write a statement about your work, or you're going to be sitting with someone and they're going to ask you, well, what kind of work do you do? You're going to have to be describing your process, your product, your sensibility, your interests to somebody, either in casual conversation or written language. People have often said to me, and I guess I understand it, why am I reading reviews of shows that I have not seen? Like, why would I want to be doing that? The writers are extremely good at what they do. It is very difficult to write 400 words, 300 words about artwork. You should try it sometime if you haven't tried to do it. Even writing a review of a show you see here in Atlanta, just for the exercise of it. What did you like? What's the work like? How descriptive are you going to be? This is a place where you can read extremely good writers writing about a variety of exhibitions, and you find interesting turns of phrase that you may want to steal. You find interesting ways of describing artworks that you might not have thought about. You may find artists who share an affinity with you and your work. So they're describing, if you make paintings that are remotely in the spirit of these big abstract works, well, John Motley is obviously a writer who's writing about this particular show, so here's another way to identify writer to subject. But I may find myself thinking about my show because I read something in a review of Alex's work that helps me clarify what Alex is doing about painting and how it fits within my plan, right? So again, all of this becomes really helpful just in that one aspires to get reviews in magazines. All of you may be showing your work. There's only so many spots for things to get covered. When you get a review, it is certainly resume worthy. Everybody loves getting reviews, except if they're critical. Most reviews these days are not super critical. By the time you're seeing them in magazines, you'll find most of them are somewhat descriptive, usually optimistic, and they usually don't get kind of cut off at the knees in an article. They usually don't write about stuff they're not interested in. But the descriptions, the nature of the writing, Hubbard is silkscreened in large pages of a seafood restaurant menu on top of variously modeled rainbow palettes. The paintings on view in Macarone's South Gallery, on the other hand, are abstract and bright. For these canvases, the artist appears to have rigorously rolled and squeegeed oil paint and resin onto flat stretches of uninterrupted color and thick pooling concentrations. Abstract expressionism is referenced. Sculptural situations are referenced. You start to get a handle on like just critical writing about contemporary art. And this is an easy, good way to get a handle on it. This is not super theoretical writing. It's not usually inaccessible writing. Most of these reviews, certainly in art papers and Art in America and Art Forum for the most part, you may not know all the references, but they're pretty much being written for you. The people in this room is the audience. And so, again, that's something to pay attention to. Art news, same thing. Same thing. Here's Jerry Cullen in Atlanta. You want to find out where these places are, you want to find out what their policies are. This is where all of that information resides. Larger articles or bigger reviews. I mean, I'm not showing you feature articles because I think you know what feature articles are. You read them, and if you're interested in them, you glean information. But, you know, Marina Abramovic is coming here in February 24th. SCAD is bringing her here. We've done programming last year because of her show at MoMA. We screened a series of films on Marina. We did a talk with the artist Anya Liftig, who's from Atlanta, who's now in New York, who sat at the infamous The Artist is Present performance at MoMA. So these magazines and the things that are in them are not remote from your everyday experience. These things are actually quite connected to the Atlanta scene. When, you know, my colleague Jennifer tweets stuff on our website or puts stuff on our Facebook account, it's like often it's this kind of stuff. Dana Schutz, who we're showing right now, every other week or so there'll be some article or something or something mentioned, often in these kinds of publications about that. This is where that content often now has another second or third life, because it's stuff that you can post, you can blog about, you can respond to. The other thing that I'm always interested in is the fact that I wonder, I don't know about this, I think I have an opinion about it, which is it's my general assessment that the days of people arguing about articles in magazines are over. When I went to school, and this may sound like a very older nostalgic thing, these magazines published articles and reviews and things that people would read avidly and then get into major disagreements about because of somebody saying the show at MoMA was fabulous, somebody else saying the show sucked. You know, all of this was like discursive. Part of the reasons that it was also fun to read this stuff was that it then gave you other things to talk about with people. So that if you go to shows here in Atlanta and you see enough of them and your colleagues and friends see enough of them, you actually can have a serious discussion about, well, what did we think about that show here or at Saltworks or at the High? What did we think about Kathy Fox's review in Arts Critical ATL or in the HAC? And so all of this really is a prompt for discussion. I'm curious for people in the room. I mean, when was the last time you emailed somebody, sent somebody an article, talked about one of these things with your colleagues? Is that something that actually happens here?
Occasionally.
Yeah.
Occasionally, but it's...
And I don't mean here as any worse than anywhere else. I'm just saying
Yeah, no, but I usually just something that pops up online or something that I find and I might send it to someone who I think would be interested. Yeah, but it's not like a weekly thing.
Yeah.
It's just, it happens to pop up, but there's only a few people that I do that with.
I think you don't need mass amounts of people, but it's interesting to be able to think that these articles are shareable with other people that you know, that quotes from, I mean, part of what I'm enjoying with this, in this process of working on a book that tries to look at some of these things, is that I never know where the content, the statement, the one little quote, the one little interesting way of the turn of phrase is not going to be incredibly meaningful to me all of a sudden. And so I think one of the realities is that, and if you want to get a handle on, I mean, obviously these are all recent issues of these things. I guess I started the talk by saying one of the things that I was most interested in when I was younger was looking at the decades that preceded me as a way of understanding what went on. And you can easily do that, you know, not always at this kind of disposal. You know, this is anybody, okay, so we know what Art Papers looks like now. That's what Art Papers look like then. So where this is from. But I mean, you want to get a handle on, this is January 1993, and this looks 100 years old already. But You want to get a handle on what's being written about, big interviews, lots of interviews. But all of these things are insights into a particular period or a particular place. And so if you have access to, if you're teaching somewhere, if you're going to school somewhere, and you have access to these kinds of libraries, you can very quickly get a handle on the history of people that work in your tradition without even being very dogmatic about it. You know, it's not that you have to become research-centric in all of this and now pore over this stuff. It's just that it can be enjoyable and it can be insightful without it being homework. You know, I don't know if there's a follow-up here. No. But again, I think, you know, these are ways of seeing things without leaving the comfort of your house. They're ways really of finding out things that are, as my opinion obviously, that are really your responsibility to know at some level. I don't know any uninformed, really amazing artists. I just don't. I don't know artists unaware of the history of the mediums they work in. I don't know artists who are unaware of the ideas that inform people who work like them historically. And that's just about making the work, regardless about career and movement and hustling and all of that stuff. But if you're interested in that, there's almost no other way to find out about the scene bigger than where you live than by doing some version of this. And I would tell you that when you meet people who are my colleagues around the field, curators at other institutions, I mean, there's an opening tonight at the Dalton Gallery at Agnes Scott, okay? By the time you meet Lisa Lembeck or Michael Rooks at the High or myself or Andrea Barnwell-Brownlee at Spelman, this is all the stuff we pay attention to. If you don't pay attention to this on some level, you miss an opportunity of things to converse with us about, other artists about, and you do yourself a disservice. I don't know, you don't have to be a careerist knucklehead to take advantage of this. Do you have a question?
I was wondering about reading reviews all the time, and when was it that it changed from writing more criticism about different artists, good or bad, didn't like the show? I don't remember the last time I read and researched an artist. Like, at what time period did that start to change?
In the heyday of, well, I mean, what's interesting about this is people would locate probably that change with the boom of the market, right? There's a point where in the last several years, and now we're in an economic slump, but in the 80s, there was a lot of discourse around artwork, value, who was hot, all of that. When magazines and their readership was reliant on who was taking out ad space, which is how these magazines happen. You often don't have galleries interested in spending lots of money to take out ads when their shows get slammed. It's not a good dialogue. Now, magazines will tell you that if you advertise in the magazine, that has absolutely nothing to do with whether you get reviewed or not. And I will tell you, as somebody who used to own a gallery in New York that never took out ads and got lots of reviews, that to some degree is true. It is not a one-to-one relationship between you take out ads out in magazines all the time, spend thousands and thousands of dollars, and you get glowing reviews. It's almost just that I think criticism, for the most part, became, and I don't mean criticism like this sucks criticism. I mean like really honing an argument, making a rigorous unpacking of why something is good or bad or relevant or interesting or not. That in a way got more relegated to journals and more specific kind of readerships than mainstream magazines that were trying to appeal to a really wide variety of people. You can still, I found one very recently, this was interesting. There's a woman named Michelle Grabner. She's a painter in Chicago. She is also the owner and curator of a place called the Suburban. It's in suburbs of Chicago. It's a gallery she opened as an extension of her house. She invites friends and people whose art she's interested in to do one-of-a-kind installations in this place. She's also an artist who writes for magazines. She writes for Art Forum usually. And then there's a whole history there of like artists who write for magazines, which was always an interesting way of getting another voice and another awareness. We brought Mira Shore here. She's been in exhibitions here. She's a writer for magazines. She's written a lot for various publications. But Michelle just wrote the most critical piece I've ever read in a recent review of an installation in Chicago by a guy named Tony Tassett, who's a friend of mine, who I've shown, and who's a friend of hers in Chicago. Ripped him a new one, like totally, in this review in the back of Art Forum. And I was stunned, because I thought, wow, that's really, and I didn't disagree with her. I mean, she was being somewhat complimentary about Tony's early work and saying that his work has taken a turn towards more populist public art, and that she was like saddened by that turn because she thought the work got like much less effective, much more broad, not as interesting as it once was. And I haven't asked him about it yet, but I'm totally interested in the idea of how did that happen? Like, what does that mean locally? Like, to people who know all of them and know that that's a tough thing to do. And if you're going to do it, you better really like believe it. I've got way more respect. I got a decent amount of respect for her already, but that was really interesting to me. And so the reason that I just wanted to sort of do this little presentation, and this is not every magazine, it's not, you know, a broad survey. You can look at any number of other publications and find different kinds of information in there. But I think there is something about paying attention to this with a little bit more focus that will start to make the world of all of this, you know, the field and your access to it a little more transparent and a little less daunting. Gene?
Just quickly, in the spirit of the topic,
Yeah.
and you're a very good communicator, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about generally the way that we communicate now. Maybe we don't have these big conversations, long drawn out, critical conversations, but I still see people reacting now more in like the realm of the blogs. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of curious what you think about, as we go more from magazines to the digital media, how that conversation can carry on, and will that make you happy? Is it going to make you sad? Is it?
I don't know. I'm trying to resist seeming like I'm nostalgic for the old days, but I think there's something about, let's face it, most of these conversations would happen in bars, so that was always fun because lubrication helps with all of this kind of stuff. But the other thing that happens in that, what's certainly been called the democratization of like opinions about stuff, is that the handful of people who get to write in these magazines have been destabilized on some level, right? They're not the only voices in the game. And so what you have is much less several key people who are doing all of the writing, talking, and room for all kinds of other opinions. It tends to be faster, it tends to be shorter, it tends to be more immediately like here and then gone. I think there's a lot of room for all of the blogs. I mean, and what's interesting is that even I did this with, this is interesting, here's something you couldn't really do. In the old days it would be a letter to the editor, which certainly would often not get printed. Now the feedback loop of blogs makes it almost immediate. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. I mean, so the Dana Schutz show got a wonderful, I don't know if you may have had a chance to see it earlier, Dana Schutz show got a wonderful review in Arts Critic ATL by Kathy Fox. Kathy comes all the time, and people may read her. So she wrote like a really ravey review. She loves Dana Schutz's work. She didn't know Dana Schutz's drawings. She complimented us on doing the show. And then somewhere in the back of the review, she said, clearly it must have been some economic reason that the Contemporary decided to not show Dana's paintings, but rather focused on their drawings, and the drawings are wonderful. And it was like, so it was a very positive thing, but somehow she got into her head that we didn't show paintings, or that we couldn't show paintings, and that the drawing show, as excellent as it was somehow like a lower animal form. Now, I could tell her over a drink that I thought that was like not right and factually incorrect, but it was much more wonderful to immediately be able to like say, "Dear Kathy, like, thank you for this wonderful review, but I feel like we need to correct you because the show was a drawing show from the beginning. If I wanted to do a painting show, I would have done a painting show. But no one has done a drawing show. And in the spirit of what we think we should be doing in Atlanta, we like the idea of being the only institution on the planet that has done a Dana Schutz drawing show and have that be in Atlanta." And so, like, right there, blogs allow stuff that would be in pod. You know, and she called me and thanked me for the correction, and now other people can add into that or not. But it creates a very different sort of feedback loop, and that's really interesting to me. I did a project years ago because I've written reviews for magazines, and I've written a lot of stuff for a lot of different magazines as well, art magazines and more broad kind of fashion and culture magazines. I did a project years ago which was called Haiku Criticism. So for people who are interested in poetry, haiku criticism was something that I sort of came up with, which was the idea of seeing if you could write a review of an exhibition in 17 syllables. And if you want to try that one, like, that's really fun. People know about haiku or have read haiku. So haiku traditionally is usually, if you're reading like, you know, traditional Japanese haiku, there's usually like, you're given an immediate season, you're giving a sort of landscape setting of some sort, which has often been talked about haiku, this is interesting, on filmic terms, that the first line of a haiku is like an establishing shot in film. The second line, which is now like more of the content of what the poem's going to be about, is more like a mid shot. And the third line, which often has that, what they call the aha moment, right, is a jump cut in film. So now it could be like a close-up or something that breaks. And I thought, well, this is not uninteresting in relationship to the way we talk about shows on the street in a much more candid, like, so a haiku criticism might be a description of the show, a particular more focus like on a certain thing, and then the opinion. And so I asked a variety of writers, poets, and people who, you know, normally do reviews to see if they could write reviews of New York exhibitions using that format, you know, 575 syllables. And it was really lively, really interesting. Now, friends of mine have said, this was like, whatever, 10 or 15 years ago, friends have said, and I may take them up on it, that that idea is perfect for a blog. I haven't done anything with it, so don't steal this idea. But it was just something that seemed like, I mean, a friend of mine who really loved that project said, God, that would be something that was so easy to do now, because you would immediately, it would be the kind of thing you'd post on Facebook, it would be the kind of thing you could tweet, right? It just has a, like that, this was an idea that was waiting for the technology to make it usable and broad and broadcastable now. So, I don't know, we may have to like resuscitate this. But you know, right, I know. I'll take that chance. But no, but that was something that like would only come out of like being interested in forms of criticism, being interested in descriptive language, being interested in ways you could talk about exhibitions in a variety of formats. And so, I mean, I think that answers your question. Other Does this make sense? I mean, do you feel like this might be helpful on some level?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is exactly what I need.
I mean, I think it's, I realize that all of the, I mean, when I say that these are talks for artists, which is primarily how I conceive of them, I realize that all of the stuff I'm talking about, for the most part, is the external stuff. Stuff in the world that is like not exactly about what, you know, you feel as you're making work. But I think it can actually help, it can help and inform. It doesn't have to always be about the career. I mean, all of this, which is certainly a mechanism of careers, reviews and articles and all of that, believe me, artists use, collectors pay attention to, galleries pay attention to, curators pay attention to. All of those things are part of the mix. But they're ultimately usable by artists and creative people because they give you insights into language and ideas and the look of things. You go back to that ad. I mean, I've done a project here as part of one of the earlier talks that I gave, which is just thinking about how you would take pictures in your own studio. Just make an ad for yourself in your mind. Like, you know, you don't have a place to put it right now, but how would you take a picture of your process, whatever that is? Is there anything inherently interesting about where you work and how you do your work that would make an interesting photograph? What would that photograph look like? What would it say about what you do? You know, and that's a photograph that could appear on a website if any of you have website. I mean, that's the other thing. I know so many artists now who have websites that have blog components, that have their own place for their voice to be writing about not only what they do, but other links to things that they do. All of this is relevant to that. And so in a way, I just think all of this stuff has this kind of mechanism whereby it can inform, it can connect you to other stuff you don't know about. And ultimately, you're just trying to get into the arena with the things that are close to what you care the most about. You're trying to meet the people, get to know the places, get to know the critical voices that are the most predisposed to be interested in what you do. Whether they're going to be interested, you can't know any of that. That's a roll of the dice. But it's like, as I've often said, like being an artist for the rest of your life is, I mean, certainly it's a joyful thing that you can only do by doing it. It obviously has frustrations. You are going to bang your head against a wall in a lot of ways. My question is always like, figure out the right wall to hit your head against. Because people get very disenfranchised often, sending stuff to places that are never going to be interested in what they do, for reasons which have nothing to do with it. You're a nice fellow, you make interesting things, but the place that shows Dieter Roth is not going to be interested in a terribly younger artist. They're working with very esteemed, already canonized people. And I can't tell you, I know for a fact how many people who sent things to Pace Gallery and like well-known galleries that just like, if they would have done 1 minute of research. I'll end with this one story, which I think is indicative of this, and then other questions. When I had a gallery in New York, I had a gallery that was about as big as this room, and it had a concrete floor like this room that came in straight off the street. It was a little storefront in Soho in New York. And I got a letter one day from an artist in the Midwest. Dear Stuart and Paul, who was my business partner, I just know that you would love to show my big concrete sculptures. I live in blah, 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 Wisconsin, and I've had some interesting shows here. I make very large work. The work is difficult to ship. It's obviously very heavy, but I know that you would be interested in this. And we looked at this like, nuts, like we can't ship giant sculptures in from the Midwest. There's no way. So we wrote a form letter back, you know, which was like, Dear Bill, your work sounds interesting, but we have budgets and size limitations and things that make it impossible to show you. Best of luck, blah, blah, blah. Now, this is why I usually say you shouldn't send things to people unless you know something about them or have visited the location. If you have a chance to, now you can see through websites a lot of information. If that person would have said, Dear Stuart and Paul, I see that your gallery is a storefront with a concrete floor of a modest size. I make very large sculptures in the Midwest out of concrete. and I think your work, your show, your gallery would be great. I know you can't send it would be like impossible to send very large works. What I'd like to do is propose an installation for your space that I could make in New York with 3 bags of concrete that I could buy at any hardware store and make on site, and then that work would be destroyed at the end of the show or sold or whatever, but it could totally be done very cheaply, very efficiently, and given the sensibility of the gallery, might work really well. That just went to maybe. Your job is to go from no to maybe. And the way you do that is having more information, because you can at least get further down the road. If you've come to this location, if you make great big outdoor sculpture, you may say, you know, every time I come to the Contemporary, I see that big metal pavilion out there, and I've never seen, or only in the 4 years that I've been here, I've seen 2 or 3 things that they've done out there. But I'm going to propose to them a neon light sculpture that would go on the metal frame, or a gauzy, woozy room that could be created by attaching fabric to the structure, or whatever. And you could do that with us, and White Space, and Mocha, and Emory, and wherever, if you go over there. Now, I'm not saying that me or any of those people would be interested in that, but we would be so much closer to being interested if you looked at those things and potentially saw a way of imagining your work in those environments and made a prudent proposal. Just the exercise would be worth something. And just the conversation would tell me you are paying attention. And that goes a really long way. So I think, you know, all of these talks are meant to try to like make it a little easier, be a little more candid about how it all works, and ultimately empower you to feel like you have a way to get what you want done. So that's all I would say, unless there's other questions, which I'm happy to try to answer. Okay.
Well, there's always this big question about what is art, right? And I'm curious if there's the same question about what is an art magazine. And because there's so many different types of artists with different types of work, I don't know, like, if you have any insights into that, and how you might go out and identify what those are for your particular personality and, you know, medium.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, all of the magazines, not unlike all of the institutions. The artist Alan Capra used to call these things frames of mind. That could be a theater, it could be a library, it could be a museum. All of those things, what that phrase meant that he used was like, they all have a conceit about what is supposed to happen in them, right? A museum, for the most part, is a collecting institution. An art center is, for the most part, a exhibition-making institution. A magazine called Blind Spot or Aperture are photograph magazines that do not give a damn about sculpture, for the most part. They write exclusively about photography and the nature of what goes on in that field. Other magazines that are broader, Flash Art is one of the only truly sort of European, global focused all over the world. It's based in Italy, but I think for the most part it tries to be covering all of the bases on the global situation. Frieze, which is based in London, has a particularly British slant, but also pays service to what's going on elsewhere. All of those places, for the most part, publications, places, and I would almost use them in this, you know, interchangeably, are run by people who have particular sensibilities. If you ask Sylvie Fortin, the editor of Art Papers, what she's interested in, she'll tell you, and how the magazine excuse me, is shaped and what it decides to do, for the most part, is privileged on what Sylvie's thoughts are about the most significant work. I don't want to put words in her mouth. Sylvie's not a particularly big painting fan, let's say. She's interested in more transient forms of art, more conceptual forms of art, more anti-commercial forms of art. Other editors at other magazines would have totally different sensibilities. Other curators at other institutions will think about what they do very differently maybe than what I do. Or I tend to work with and be friends with the people who are more in sympathy with the way I think about things, as you might as artists or collectors or patrons or whatever else. So even for institutions, finding their own peers or role models or situations out in the world, I mean, I'm saying to you as artists, for the most part, that what you should pay attention to or think about, at least on occasion, and I'm saying that no way different than what I would say about what I should be doing, which is to pay attention to institutions that are doing interesting things in terms of what are their, we've talked about this, Gina's on our board, what should our signage be in the gallery? How many brochures should we make? Should we send postcards out? Should we have a blog ourselves? Should be, I mean, all of the things that we think about as an institution are really no different than what I think artists think about in the promotion of their work. And I guess this would be another revelatory thing, because I started as an artist. I think about the institution no way different than what I would say to a painter, printmaker, sculptor about their process. I have a slightly different set of things to play with, but for the most part, it's about doing things, making things, and having them be engaged with audiences. Budgets may be different, it may be more collaborative. An artist in their studio may have themselves, or they may work collaboratively. I have my several peers and a board and a budget and a space to play with. But the process of thinking about all of that, I really don't think it's all that different. Which is, you know, a good bullshit detector for me to say, if I'm sitting here telling you what I think is all like the way to do it, and then I don't take my own advice, like, shame on me. You know, so that's probably a good place to end. But thank you for coming. I always appreciate when people seem to be interested in what we're up to. We have booklets at the front of the gallery that tell you the next series of upcoming talks. Several of them are part of our Contemporary Talk series. So John Yao, the poet and critic and writer, who's written some amazing books on Jasper Johns. Helen Molesworth, who's a curator from the ICA Boston. These are all people in the field who are quite significant, who've never been here, who've never lectured. We're doing those in partnership with other institutions, with SCAD, with Emory. Certainly go see Marina if you can. And SCAD is doing their own version of bringing a lot of interesting folks to town. So anyway, just thank you for coming. Look forward to seeing you all again.